faces, let me begin by wishing all of you a very happy new year. I'm also glad the sun is out and the blinds are up because we are happy our speaker is not using PowerPoint, so you can get a sense of why we like this room so much. A couple of announcements. Tomorrow on the 10th, a fellow of the NMML, Dr. Manisha Sethi, is giving a talk on death by encounter, strategies of impunity. On Monday, the 13th of January, we have a talk in the series Cities in History. Dr. Prashant Kidambi, University of Leicester, will be speaking on Writing the City, Reflections on the Urban Turn in South Asian Historiography. And on the 15th, we have a eminent speaker, former senior fellow, now at the Shiv Nadar University, Professor Deepankar Gupta, in the series India and Transition. And it's a very fascinating topic given recent events, from factory producerist to civic consumerist, contemporary trends in Indian politics and society. Thursday and Friday next week, you're all invited. We have a 2-day conference, Motilal Nehru and His Times. Occasional papers are all available on the web, but just very quickly, some recent papers in the History and Society series. Brian Catton, Writing the History of a Colonial Institution, The Case of the Government Cattle Farm Hisar. Ramathaut Khongwareu, Raids, Customary Laws and Slavery, Reinterpreting Pre-Colonial Naga Warfare. There are other papers in Perspectives in Indian Development and Samaj Evam Itihas. It's a privilege to welcome Ajantha Subramanian here today. Ajantha did her doctoral work at Duke University. It was published in a very well-regarded book, Shorelines, Space and Rights in South India. She is now at Harvard, where she's in the Department of Anthropology. She's going to be talking to us about some very fascinating work she's been doing. She's entitled her paper, The Meritocrats, the Indian Institute of Technology and the Social Life of Caste. So without further ado, Dr. Subramanian.
Thanks, Mahesh, for the invitation to be here, and thank you all for attending. As Mahesh mentioned, the title of the talk is The Meritocrats, the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Social Life of Caste. In India today, the technical sciences are prized as the true measure of intellectual worth and a proven means of professional advancement. The technical graduate has become India's greatest export, widely understood to exemplify her comparative advantage in the global marketplace. The value and mobility of Indian technical knowledge are most graphically represented by the success story of the Indian Institutes of Technology. Deemed institutions of national importance by the IIT Act of 1961, the IITs are directly administered and financed by the Indian central government and fall outside the structure of affiliation to universities, giving them far greater autonomy in institutional functioning, faculty hiring, and curricular development. Their autonomy was guaranteed in other ways as well. In the name of ensuring merit as the only basis for admission, they were originally exempted from policies of compensatory discrimination applied by regional states to their engineering colleges. Over the past 40 years, the IITs have become stepping stones to transnational mobility, at their peak sending approximately 2/3 of their graduating classes to the US. IIT graduates have become the poster children of Indian education, with many joining the upper echelons of Indian and American industry and academia. Within Indian and to a lesser degree American public discourse, the IITian has become an exemplar of intellectual merit and of India's shining arrival on the stage of global modernity. What gets occluded in such assessments of the IITian's innate intelligence and competitiveness are the forms of accumulated social and cultural capital that have enabled admission to the IITs. The majority of IITians come from upper caste families of bureaucrats, school teachers, and academics, where capital has long been held in education. While arguably from middle-class origins, the value of their accumulated caste capital has suddenly spiked due to the reorganization of late 20th and early 21st century capitalism around the knowledge economy. At the same time, the role of caste and state in producing IITians has been obscured in favor of their portrayal as socially disembedded, uniquely meritorious individuals. What does the naturalization of the IITians' merit and the elevation of the IITs to emblems of Indian modernity mean for the possibilities and limits of democratic transformation in India? More broadly, what are the structures, discourses, and forms of affiliation that shape the contours of democratic social stratification? In this talk, I argue that the politics of merit at the IITs illuminates the social life of caste in contemporary India. Building on Pierre Bourdieu's work on the forms of capital and Satish Deshpande's on the social life of caste, I show that the IITian status depends on the transformation of privilege into merit, or of caste capital into modern capital. At the same time, I argue for a relational approach that illuminates claims to merit not simply as the transformation of capital, but as responses to subaltern assertion. Analyzing meritocracy in relation to subaltern politics allows us to see the contextual specificity of such claims. At one moment, they may be articulated through the disavowal of caste, at another, through caste affiliation. This back and forth movement between the marking and unmarking of caste suggests the need for greater nuance in approaching the concept of meritocracy. Instead of the progressive erasure of ascribed identities in favor of putatively universal ones, caste and merit are intimately linked. Moreover, the articulation of caste and merit does not simply express an already constituted caste identity. Rather, claims to merit have generated newly consolidated forms of upper casteness. In his essay, The Forms of Capital, Pierre Bourdieu calls for more attention to the different forms of capital, economic, cultural, and social, and the mechanisms through which one is converted to the other. He offers a particularly insightful analysis of embodied cultural capital, those accumulated effects of family and class history that become an integral part of the person and are usually recognized not as capital, but as competence. In this way, he says, embodied cultural capital, quote, manages to combine the prestige of innate property with the merits of acquisition, unquote. However, Bourdieu points out that there is an inherent instability to embodied capital that is stabilized through the alchemy of institutional recognition, in the form, for instance, of academic qualifications. Such institutional mediation not only stabilizes cultural capital, it also endows it with greater legitimacy by appearing to be autonomous of accumulated history and social relationality. Finally, it makes cultural capital into a currency more easily traded in the marketplace. Bourdieu's analysis dovetails nicely with the recent work of sociologist Satish Deshpande, who calls for more analysis of how upper castes are rendered casteless in India. The story of how upper castes, quote, transform their caste capital into modern capital, unquote, is not well known, he says, because, quote, it runs with the grain of the dominant common sense, unquote. When it is seen and heard, quote, it appears to be a story about something other than caste, like the story of nation building, for example. By contrast, the political encashment of caste by low castes is a recurrent, publicly debated theme. The result of this asymmetry, Deshpande maintains, is that the upper castes are naturalized as the casteless inheritors of modernity, while the lower castes are hypervisible as the illegitimate purveyors of caste. For upper caste, Deshpande argues, quote, caste qua caste has already yielded all that it can, and represents a ladder that can now be safely kicked away. Having encashed its traditional caste capital and converted it into modern forms of capital like property, higher educational credentials, and strongholds in lucrative professions, this section believes itself to be casteless today, unquote. The post-colonial present thus appears to be one where non-elites have caste, while elites have class and other more cosmopolitan affiliations. It's undoubtedly true that non-elites have embraced caste as a vehicle of empowerment, and that collective mobilization for low-caste rights is in both formal and informal political arenas has changed the contours of Indian society and politics. However, I would argue with Deshpande that this only underscores the need for work on how caste operates at the other end of the spectrum. Significantly, the proliferation of work on lower caste that shows the increasing significance of caste, not simply as a discrete unit based on birth, but as a consolidated socio-political category, has not led to enough work on how upper castes are similarly consolidating in multiple arenas and through a variety of discursive registers. My own work looks at the role of the technical sciences, and the IITs in particular, in transforming caste capital into modern capital, and in producing newly consolidated forms of upper casteness. Despite the discursive erasure of caste in IITians' public self-representations, I show that caste continues to be a highly salient form of distinction and affiliation for them. I'm particularly interested in how the notion of merit comes to index caste belonging and serve as a publicly legitimate expression of caste distinction. Whereas at an earlier moment, status might have been more explicitly tied to caste, structural continuities allow the same social groups to now inhabit merit as a collective virtue. At the same time, caste is itself being reconstituted and consolidated through the leveraging of modern, putatively universal forms of knowledge. I analyzed the relationship between merit, caste, and technical knowledge through the study of one IIT, IIT Madras, located in Tamil Nadu's capital city of Chennai, and of its transnational diaspora. Tamil Nadu is a particularly illuminating context in which to look at this relationship because its history of backward caste political assertion has complicated the naturalization of merit and the transformation of upper castes into casteless moderns. Here, as in other regions with strong traditions of caste rights politics, upper caste merit has long been understood as a product of historical privilege and not simply of innate ability. In this sense, Tamil Nadu calls into question Deshpande's account of castelessness as a stable structure of modern upper caste subjectivity that has only recently been destabilized by events such as Mandal. Departing from Deshpande's analysis, I ask how the dialectic of low caste rights and high caste merit in Tamil Nadu might inform an analysis of caste more broadly. When do upper caste claim merit on the basis of castelessness, and when on the basis of caste? As I hope to show, when subaltern assertion destabilizes upper caste merit, elite claims to universal subjectivity give way to more identitarian articulations of caste and collectivity, of self and collectivity. Following Bourdieu, I also show that in these moments, other sources of legitimation, like the institutional pedigree, become very important stabilizing factors. Let me now turn to Tamil Nadu and to IIT Madras. I'll first give you a brief account of the role of caste in the longer history of technical education in colonial Madras presidency, and then come to the post-independence politics of merit at IIT Madras. Caste played a critical role in the induction of Indians into formal technical training in the late colonial period. Through the 19th century, racial barriers to technical education were expressed through a clear preference for recruiting engineers from England. It was only with the expansion of public works in the late 19th and early 20th century that the colonial government began its investment in formal technical training for Indians. The question of what kind of training this would be and what kind of man was suited for it was hotly debated in Madras presidency. From the beginning, we see colonial efforts to track Indians into different tiers of technical training: craft enhancement for artisans, industrial training for mechanics and other workmen, and professional education for engineers, and the role of a sociology of caste in distinguishing between the trades, industrial labor, and the professions. This quote from the Madras Presidency's Public Works Department is just one example of how colonial administrators differentiated among the kinds of technical training for different categories of Indians. Quote, "A master workman must know his trade and know it well, but a civil engineer has a craft of his own. His skill is in his science. His tools are his formulae and his surveying and mathematical instruments. His labors are for the most part those of the mind. His studies those of projecting and controlling. And he must therefore be one of a very different class and status in society, as well as of totally different attainments from those of the mechanic, whose labors he has to direct." Unquote. In determining status, colonial officials drew upon their understanding of regional social stratification. In the Southeast, caste was the principal category of administrative sociology, as seen in a note penned in 1907 by the Director of Public Instruction, expressing concern that, quote, "Out of the large population of this presidency, less than 3,000 children were receiving technical instruction in the various handicrafts, and of these, less than 900 were non-Brahmin Hindus, the class of the community to which the bulk of hereditary workers in wood and metal and textile fabrics belong." Unquote. Here we see not only the emphasis on hereditary work, a code for caste labor, but also how the language of policy was coming to echo the discursive categories of the non-Brahmin movement that was picking up pace in the region. Through the 1910s, the enhancement of non-Brahmin hereditary occupations, and concern over what a more laissez-faire approach to technological development would do to indigenous industry remain centerpieces of technical education policy in Madras. This was due in large part to the efforts of Alfred Chatterton, the principal of the Madras School of the Arts, who in his advocacy for industrial schools suggested that, quote, instruction in each industry should be confined to the sons and relatives of those actually engaged in the industry at the present time. That is to say, we should carry on the industrial schools on a caste basis, unquote. While Chatterton's primary concern was to build up indigenous industry, and to do so without displacing an existing artisanal population, his proposals only strengthened and naturalized the link between caste and technical skill. That caste was key to the tracking of groups into technical education is evident in who did benefit from professional training. As the numbers of Europeans in Madras Presidency's engineering profession fell over the early 20th century, Brahmins were the single largest group of Indians who filled the vacuum. This despite being barely 3% of the total regional population. Anthropologist Chris Fuller has looked at why Brahmins, who historically disdained practical knowledge because of its association with low-cost manual labor, flooded the ranks of colonial engineering, despite its hands-on character. He argues that it was the distinction between industrial labor and artisanship on the one hand, and the engineering profession on the other, that ultimately convinced Brahmins that they could enter this new profession without the loss of status. As did the Public Works Department, Brahmins foregrounded the centrality to the engineering profession of science, and more importantly, mathematics, long perceived as a preeminent intellectual discipline, and one for which Brahmins were thought to have a natural propensity. From the outset, then, we see a convergence between a colonial sociology of caste, the stratification of technical training, and new modes of collective self-representation. Even as Brahmins and other upper castes were inducted into modern professions where secular credentials were ostensibly more important than family and community, the preoccupation with caste-appropriate choices persisted. Rather than a shift from caste to modern forms of subjectivity, then, the modern professional was always also a caste self. The correlation between caste and occupation and the overrepresentation of Brahmins in the modern professions became a rallying cry of the non-Brahmin movement. In its later guise as Dravidian cultural nationalism, the movement profoundly reshaped the Tamil political and social milieu. A century later, Tamil Nadu is now known for its highly politicized low-caste majority, the predominance of regional parties emerging out of Dravidianism, and far-reaching institutional reform through the implementation of caste quotas in education and employment. One of the effects of Dravidianism has been a lasting cleavage between Tamil Nadu's other castes and Tamil Brahmins, with caste privilege more closely tied to Brahminness than in most other parts of India. To turn Deshpande's argument on its head, Dravidianism interrupted the translation of caste capital into modern capital by making Brahmins hyper-visible as castes. Within the technical sciences, too, the impact of Dravidianism was far-reaching. The Southeast was one of the first regions where caste quotas in education and employment were implemented. The reservation system has expanded steadily to the point where now most engineering colleges in Tamil Nadu, most regional ones, reserve up to 69% of their seats for those designated as backward castes. These measures have had considerable success at changing the caste composition of engineering from the days when Tamil Brahmins filled over 70% of seats. How then do Brahmins and other upper castes in Tamil Nadu navigate this socio-political terrain? When do they claim merit on the basis of castelessness and when on the basis of caste? And what role has IIT Madras played in this process? In this context, the founding of IIT Madras in 1959 played a critical role in suturing caste and technical merit. As a central government institution initially exempt from caste quotas, it has long been seen by its detractors as an upper caste stronghold where claims to intellectual superiority have strong caste overtones. IIT Madras is even sardonically referred to by some in the vernacular press as Iyer Iyengar technology. What is less considered in these popular discourses is how the institution operates as a critical site, not for the expression of an already consolidated group identity, but for the very constitution of Tamil Brahminness and upper casteness. At IIT Madras, distinguishing high from low caste and an IITian's knowledge from that accrued at other engineering colleges is an ongoing preoccupation. Defining who the true IITian is has become all the more urgent a need because of key changes in the past 3 decades. The first change is the privatization of education from the 1980s and the proliferation of private engineering colleges, with increasing numbers of students from across the social spectrum acquiring degrees and gaining employment in an IT sector able to absorb huge amounts of technical labor. The second change is the explosion in coaching centers to train students to take the IIT entrance exam. This has brought in students from outside the major metropolitan centers and from lower class backgrounds. The third change was a 2006 Indian Supreme Court decision mandating the extension of quotas for backward caste students to the IITs. The quota began to be applied in admissions from 2008 and has substantially increased the number of low-caste students at IIT Madras. For the rest of the talk, I'll highlight 3 key ways of defining the true IITian that have emerged in response to these changes, and that hinge on correlations between caste, knowledge, and merit. The first way has to do with the mobility of knowledge and the idea that upper caste knowledge is more mobile than lower caste knowledge. This was strikingly conveyed to me by an IIT Madras faculty member, himself an alumnus who spent a decade in U.S. industry before returning to teach at his alma mater. He fretted to me about the negative brand effect that quota students with their regional aspirations would have. Quote, "For cultural reasons, fewer of them go abroad, and this will definitely mean a decline from those days when 70% of Silicon Valley companies had IITian names on the board," he told me. This expectation that the true IITian should be a mobile subject does not arise simply from a generic or recent claim to cosmopolitanism. It reflects the worldview of an upper caste intelligentsia who were members of an internal pan-Indian diaspora of civil servants and whose children form the core of the IITs. A shared history of education and employment mobility has given these students a sense of themselves not just as members of regional caste groupings, but as nationals who properly belong in national institutions. Within Tamil Nadu, it's Brahmins, the caste who enter the modern professions in the greatest numbers, who have historically formed the core of this internal diaspora. Since the 19th centuries, Tamil Brahmins leveraged their cultural capital as knowledge bearers to move from the countryside to the city and outside the region for employment. As a result, they're overrepresented in schools that follow the curriculum set by the central and not state board of examiners. Many attend government-run central board schools that cater to children of the National Civil Services, guaranteeing them a seat regardless of frequent interregional transfers. Others send their children to private schools, which also offer the central board exam. These central board schools explicitly state as one of their key missions, quote, "to develop the spirit of national integration and to create a sense of Indianness among children," unquote. The notion of Indianness gestures to a cosmopolitan subjectivity that is supra-regional and supra-caste. At the same time, in the Tamil context, the distinction between the regional or state board and the national or central board is not simply that between caste and castelessness. It maps quite explicitly onto low and high caste and has become the basis for claims to intellectual merit. The assumption that the central board curriculum produces thinking students who are better suited to intellectual life in general, and the IITs in particular, was conveyed to me across a wide swath of interviews with central board teachers, administrators, and students. Person after person distinguished the central board's conceptual training with a rote learning in the state boards. It was this training, they argued, that made their students a natural fit for the IITs. Karthik, a Tamil Brahmin alumnus who graduated in 1995 from IIT Madras, talked to me about his educational trajectory. He had attended the DAV Boys School in Chennai, a national private school that offers the central boards. Karthik described the school as a bubble within the city, where the vast majority of his classmates were upper caste and where getting into IIT Madras was a singular goal of his peers. Once he got to the institution, Karthik told me, he felt truly at home. He talked about the comforting sense of homecoming he felt upon entering the campus gates, where he could stop de-Brahminizing his Tamil and slip back into the Brahmin vernacular spoken by his family. He spoke of an intimacy between Tamil Brahmin students and professors through the cultivation not just of shared intellectual projects, but of a form of extended caste kinship, expressed, for instance, in invitations to family functions. But IIT Madras has not simply been a site for Brahmin caste kinship within a, quote, non-Brahmin region, unquote. On campus, other Tamilians who get in through merit-based admissions are assumed to be Brahmins simply by virtue of being at IIT. Anand, another Tamil alumnus from the late 1980s, narrated his own conscription into Brahminness. He was changing his clothes when his Tamil Brahmin roommate inquired into the whereabouts of his punal, the sacred thread worn by male Brahmins. Quote, "When I told him that I don't wear one, he paused and then asked, 'Doesn't your mother get upset?' It never struck him that I was backward caste. In fact, I think he still assumes that I'm from a particularly liberal Brahmin family." Unquote. Gopi's experience of his own illegibility speaks not so much to the castelessness of the IITian, but to his explicit marking when it comes to Tamils as Brahmin. We might think of this instance of caste misrecognition as passing in reverse. Unlike the stories of passing in the US, where blacks attempted to pass as white in order to avail of the benefits of whiteness, here it is the high caste student who needs to assimilate his lower caste peer. This desire to erase difference is particularly telling in the context of Tamil Nadu, where a long history of reservations has meant that increasing numbers of low caste do in fact inhabit the same social spaces as high caste. Here, IIT Madrasas uniquely service the need to once again differentiate high from low. Just when caste status boundaries are blurring in the wider region, within the walls of the institution, it has become imperative to mark the Tamil IITian as Brahmin. While the indexing of caste through pan-Indian mobility is one method of identifying the true IITian, the assessment of innate intelligence is another. Here, the need to define the true IITian expresses not regional caste tensions, but broader upper caste concerns about how the marketization of education has allowed lower caste and non-urbanites entry into the IITs. Examinations structure the highly competitive system of secondary and post-secondary education in India as a whole, but the IIT JEE exam is the most mythologized of them all. It is widely perceived as a near-perfect measure of merit, in part because the pan-Indian scope of the exam is assumed to filter only the best out of a vast pool of applicants. In the past 10 years, and largely due to the professional successes of IITians, coaching for the exam has become a veritable industry, with coaching centers admitting students from as early as the 7th standard, who then spend up to 5 years mastering a single exam. That families with relatively modest household incomes are willing to invest the money to send children to coaching centers speaks volumes about the expected payoff. As a consequence, the class profile of students at IIT Madras has slowly shifted over the past decade to include some from small town and rural families without as much social or cultural capital. Their arrival, however, has not been met with equanimity. In a newspaper interview about the proliferation of coaching classes, IIT Madras's former director, M.S. Ananth, clarified that he was, quote, looking for students with raw intelligence, and not those with a mind prepared by coaching class tutors. The coaching classes only help students in mastering pattern recognition skills. With this, you cannot get students with raw intelligence, unquote. This notion of raw intelligence places the ideal IITian outside institutional or even social formation as a naturally gifted individual with a native capacity for technical knowledge. In conversations with Ananth and other IIT administrators, I heard their concerns that the coaching industry undermined the ability of the exam to test for those who were truly worthy, in the process admitting students who would eventually dilute the institutional brand. It's clear that this divide between the gifted and the coached is not actually about who attends coaching classes, since virtually all IITians do. So who then are the coached? When pushed on who the coached typically were, I heard that they were from less urban, professional, and English-speaking backgrounds. These were students who went to schools where, as one administrator said ruefully, quote, rote learning was the norm, and the IIT merely represents a paycheck and a local job for life, unquote. It's indeed strange to hear IIT administrators bemoaning the economic instrumentality of the coached, when one of the hallmark features of the IIT pedigree is its market value. What then is at stake in this contrast between the approaches to education and employment of the gifted and the coached? It seems to hinge on a perceived relationship between non-market and market value, or inalienable and alienable forms of knowledge. The coached are deemed illegitimate because they are seen as gaining admission to the IIT not through their innate abilities, but because they paid money for coaching classes. They are pure creatures of the market, further evidenced by their instrumental leveraging of an IIT pedigree into, quote, a paycheck and a local job for life, unquote. The way the coached buy their way into education is thought to dilute the brand value of the IITs. By contrast, the gifted have intrinsic merit that is reflected in their performance in the exam and in the market. However, their inherent value of raw intelligence is irreducible to market value. As with the prized art object, that precisely because it is invested with a value transcending the market, gains value within the market, the true IITian's value is inalienable, and because of this, legitimately exchanged in the market. Moreover, the true IITian's innate intelligence bestows a non-market aura on their academic and career ambitions. As a result, when they play the market, as they do remarkably well, they, unlike the coached, enhance the value of brand IIT. While distinctions internal to IIT Madras constituted the true IITian as an individual with a particular caste and class profile, comparisons between the training received at the IITs and at other engineering colleges capture a third mode of defining the IITian as someone who has mastered immaterial knowledge. The association of immaterial knowledge with engineering perhaps sounds paradoxical. Unlike the pure sciences, engineering is typically thought to involve practical work with one's hands and with material objects. However, even within engineering, the difference between conceptual and practical training has become a crucial part of institutional stratification, with the IIT seen as the most conceptual of engineering colleges. Although this distinction between conceptual and practical knowledge is a long-standing one that dates back at least to the beginnings of late colonial technical training, it has become much more pronounced of late. One sees this in the shifting career trajectories of Madras IITians. When they were founded, each of the first 5 IITs was partnered with a foreign government that would facilitate technology and know-how transfer. For IIT Madras, West Germany provided financial and staff support to jumpstart the institution. Early alumni studied under German and Indian professors and followed the colonial pattern of entering public sector enterprises after a period of practical training, either in Indian or West German factories. Madras IITians who graduated in the 1960s told me that it was exposure to the factory that enhanced their love of engineering. One who graduated in 1962 narrated his career trajectory, which was a fairly common story at the time. Quote, I did my internship at one of the biggest mechanical engineering concerns in Germany, at their head office. When I came back, I worked in a company, Utko Machineries, which had 3 German collaborations and was in the state of Orissa, near the Rourkela steel plant. A lot of our products were for steel plants, for mining, and for paper industries. This kind of heavy engineering was really my cup of tea. Most of my IIT classmates were doing similar things. We thought of ourselves as literally building the country, but with German standards. That was my first job where I worked for 10 years, unquote. By contrast, most IITians who graduated after the 1980s disdained the practical dimensions of engineering, a shift away from the shop floor that coincides with the influx of a much wider spectrum of students into engineering education. In interview after interview, alumni recounted the trials of practical training and how they would do anything to avoid doing time in the labs. We thought it was beneath us to do something as dull as put together a piece of machinery, one told me. That was for people in other engineering colleges. Another described the attitude of IITians in terms that echo the Hindu textual correlation of caste duties to parts of the body. Quote, we had a greater emphasis on math and physics, a lot of problem solving on paper. You do modeling, you think about writing formulas, equations, less about doing something with your hands. Because we always thought that we should use our brains, not our hands. That was the mindset we had. It wasn't explicit, but it was understood. No one was going to say that, but it was understood that if you came through the system, took the exam, God gave you your brains, so you should use them. Hands are for other people who don't have brains, unquote. Most IIT graduates today have shifted from the industrial to the information sector, or have left engineering altogether for careers in finance and management. The pecking order of departments within the IITs has shifted accordingly, from the heyday of civil and mechanical engineering in the 1960s to the dominance of computer science today. The disassociation of IITians from the state industrial sector and association with post-industrial economies in India and the US has only reinforced their status as an intellectual elite. And indeed, most jobs in Indian heavy industry and manufacturing are now taken up by graduates of 3rd and 4th tier engineering colleges, a division of labor that discursively reinscribes the hierarchy between the conceptual and mechanical. When one considers the social profile of students in these colleges, especially in the southeast, this is clearly also a reinscription of caste hierarchy. The IITian's perceived capacity for abstract thought that makes him least suited for the shop floor, and perhaps even for the engineering profession more generally, is what corporate recruiters I interviewed in India and the US identified most readily as his unique virtue, and what makes him best suited for the knowledge industry. Recruiters in the US resort to broad-brush racial typologies in explaining the IITian's intellect with reference to India's, quote, long tradition of conceptual mathematics, unquote, or Indians' knack for numbers. Within India, however, the distinctions are finer. When I interviewed corporate recruiters from the software industry in Chennai, they typically distinguished the Madras IITian from other regional engineering graduates by his unsuitability for the industrial workplace. A few even pointedly opined that Tambrams were especially well suited for the upper echelons of information technology work. Of course, the IITs are not the only engineering colleges that send students abroad. Increasingly, other institutions have been successful at exporting their student talent. In response, IIT networks in the US have become very active in protecting their brand value to ensure its exceptional standing. Older alumni are hugely influential in inducting younger ones into university campuses and into entrepreneurial ventures. That caste distinction is at the heart of these forms of institutional kinship is evident in the political work of diasporic IITians. As the extension of OBC quotas to the IITs was being debated in the Indian Parliament, alumni in Silicon Valley, organized under the banner of Indians for Equality, took to the streets. At one such protest in Silicon Valley, an IIT alumnus commented to an Indian reporter, quote, let Arjun Singh do whatever he wants to any educational institute in India, but tell him to leave the IITs alone. It's because of us that the West has recognized the worth of India. Remember, brand India is brand IIT, unquote. This idea that the entry of low caste threatens the institutional brand is a striking instance not of the transformation of caste into modern capital, but the inverse. The market value of brand IIT depends on its continued association with upper caste. Moreover, with the invocation of the West as audience, IITians claim to be shoring up the value of brand India itself. The notion of brand India has to be situated in the context of a late 20th century politics of ascription. Whereas the explicit invocation of particularistic genealogies as a basis for social worth or market value was once discredited, we're now witnessing the resurgence of claims on these grounds. The return to genealogy has been accorded new legitimacy by the neoliberal marketplace for identities, a trend that anthropologists Jean and John Komroff have glossed as ethnicity Inc. Identitarian claims are no longer just the resort of the powerless. In the face of subaltern assertion, the powerful are also similarly inclined. However, elite mimesis of subaltern identity politics transforms identity from a form of rights to a form of capital. This is the case for the self-marking of upper caste as a mimetic response to low-caste rights politics. It's equally so in the U.S., where, in response to African American racial assertion, we have witnessed a white ethnic revival. This revival is equally present among newer diasporic groups like South Asians, who fuse culture and capital to enhance the economic value of homeland connections. This pattern of racialization for the market is evident in the role of U.S.-based, or you can also call it ethnicization for the market, is evident in the role of U.S.-based IIT alumni in facilitating Indian entrepreneurship. The Indus Entrepreneurs, an organization started by alumni in Silicon Valley in 1992, aims at consolidating transnational networks of ethnic capital. It currently boasts a membership of 13,000, and its list of mentors includes the most well-recognized Indian names in the corporate sector. In conversations with both senior mentors and junior members of the organization, it became obvious that the entrepreneurial ambitions of IITians are the most actively cultivated. When a group of IITians brings forward a proposal, they're almost guaranteed seed funding. In the U.S., these expressions of transnational kinship have both underwritten the commodity value of an IIT education and enhanced the racial mystique around the IITian's intellect. When American understandings of the IITian's racial talent travel back to India, they reinforce claims to caste exceptionalism, making it possible for IITians to claim representative authority for brand India, as upper caste global moderns. The intimacy between brand IIT and brand India is not only trumpeted by IITians themselves. The liberalizing Indian state also actively fosters the link between brand India and brand IIT as a way of marking its own disjuncture with a past of planned development. As Manmohan Singh stated in his inaugural address at the 2008 Pan-IIT Alumni Conference held at IIT Madras, quote, "I believe it is India's destiny to become a knowledge power, and the IITs have contributed handsomely in the country's efforts to realize this destiny," unquote. This shift from public industrial production to private knowledge work as the basis of national development suggests a radical shift in the imagination of post-coloniality. Now it is the high caste private sector expatriate who is held up as the exemplar of Indian merit and forerunner to a future Indian modernity. So to conclude, in post-independence India, new patterns of caste stratification and consolidation have emerged through the very process of democratic transformation. Rather than the gradual erosion of caste, what we're seeing is the leveraging of merit by high castes in order to secure new arenas of expertise and capital accumulation against low caste rights. Upper caste claims have been strengthened by transnational mobility and the resurgence within the late 20th century knowledge economy of ascriptive understandings of skill and intelligence. Rather than just subaltern identitarianism, then, the leveraging of caste must also be seen as an upper caste politics that attempts to forestall democratic progress and derives its legitimacy from a larger global politics of ascription. What are the implications of these processes for the relationship between democracy and meritocracy? The current standoff in India and elsewhere is between two competing visions of democratic equality. The first rests on a formal definition of equality that attributes social hierarchies to the natural aptitudes of individuals and groups. The second presupposes the existence of historically accumulated privileges and disadvantages and the need for compensatory measures to level opportunity. In India, education has been widely regarded as a prime instrument for improving the condition of the historically disadvantaged and their elevation as one of the most important social outcomes of education. As stated by the Ministry of Education in 1966, quote, "One of the most important social objects of education is to equalize opportunity, enabling the backward or underprivileged classes and individuals to use their education as a lever for the improvement of their condition," unquote. Towards this end, it was thought necessary to apply redistributive mechanisms to level the playing field. Mark Galanter argues in favor of defining India's approach to redistributive justice as one of compensatory discrimination, because this term, quote, "does not blink at the fact that some are left out, that we are dealing with something more than a benign process of inclusion. At least where scarce resources are distributed, it employs a principle of selection that is akin to the old discrimination. But the purpose is different. It is not exclusion and relegation, but inclusion and recompense, both for historic deprivations and to offset present handicaps," unquote. Those who most vocally oppose compensatory discrimination argue that it undercuts the principle of equality and is antithetical to merit. There are, however, different understandings of equality at stake here, and they have steadily diverged over the course of India's post-independence history. The strident claim to merit as an upper caste virtue and the discrediting of redress as special privileges or vote bank politics is evidence of increasingly incommensurate visions of the Indian future. So is merit really incommensurable with redress? Meritocracy has been upheld as a democratic ideal that is a necessary corrective to older hierarchies of status. However, in bracketing out the social and the historical, it has serviced the reproduction of privilege. Is there a way of recuperating the notion of merit to make it consistent with substantive equality? If the definition of merit could be pluralized enough to accommodate the diversity of historical experiences, it's perhaps redeemable. If, however, it continues to underpin a more standardized measure of value that necessarily favors those with accumulated cultural and social capital, it's difficult to see how meritocracy could be made commensurate with democratic ideals.